She pressed me against the mixing board, one hand flat on the surface beside my ribs, the other at my hip, and her mouth found the side of my throat, just below my ear, and stayed there, breath hot and deliberate, and my knees forgot their structural purpose entirely. I grabbed the edge of the board with both hands. Her mouth moved lower, and her hand slid from my hip to the small of my back, pulling me forward into her, and she said against my skin, "I've been thinking about firing you for 3 weeks." I said nothing because I had lost access to language. If you want to hear uncensored too hot for YouTube stories, check out my Patreon in the description. Tell us where you're watching from and subscribe. 7 hours earlier. I was calibrating Lyra Ashford's microphone at 11:53 p.m. when she walked into the booth and told me I was fired. Live, on air, to 60,000 listeners. I want to be precise about what I was doing in the exact moment it happened because the specific indignity of it stays with me. I was crouched behind the Neumann, the vintage one, the U47 she refused to replace, despite the fact that Nocturne's equipment budget would have covered 3 of them, with a small flashlight between my teeth and a precision screwdriver in my right hand. The mount bracket had been drifting a 1/4 millimeter out of true all week. Every time Lyra turned her head slightly left to read a note, the frequency response shifted. Barely audible to most people. Audible to me. Audible to her. We had not spoken about it directly, but I had started correcting for it from the board in real time, riding the high shelf filter 3 hours into every broadcast. And twice in the past 2 weeks, she had come out of the booth after sign-off and stood very still, looking at the waveform display for a long moment before leaving without a word. I did not know if she had noticed what I was doing. I assumed not. I corrected it anyway. That was my job. That was the whole of it. I kept her voice clean. I shaped the silence between her words into something that made the silence mean something. 3 months I had been doing this, 11 shifts a week, and I had gotten very good at it, and it mattered to me in the way that quiet, competent work always mattered to me. Not loudly, not with announcement, but absolutely. So I was crouched behind the Neumann with a screwdriver and a flashlight at 11:53 p.m. when the booth door opened. I did not look up immediately. I heard her footsteps. She wore flat-soled shoes for broadcast, always nothing that would create floor vibration near an open mic, and I assumed she was doing her pre-broadcast walk, which she did every night without variation. Booth check, mic check, water glass. Positioned exactly 4 inches left of center from the mic stand. Headphone cable coiled and placed on the stool, not hung. I had learned her rituals the way you learn a complicated piece of music, by repetition, by the specific shape of each beat of silence before the next note arrived. She did not do the pre-broadcast walk. She walked straight to the mic stand. She adjusted it, a small, precise movement, maybe 2 degrees of tilt, barely perceptible. And then she leaned into the Neumann, and the on-air light had already gone red, and her voice came through the monitors the way it always did, like something that had weight and temperature. She said, "This will be my last broadcast with this production team. Effective immediately." I went completely still. The screwdriver was still in my hand. I work best alone. I was 3 feet from her. I was crouched behind the microphone she was speaking into. The city was listening. 60,000 people in their cars, their kitchens, their late-night apartments, hearing Lyra Ashford say she worked best alone in that particular voice of hers, the one that had been landing in my chest for 3 months like something with claws. And I was close enough to see the fine silver chain of her ear cuff catch the light from the on-air sign. She finally looked at me. Dark eyes, no apology, no explanation. The expression on her face was exactly what it always was when she looked at the waveform display and found something that needed correcting. Precise, contained, giving nothing. She said, "You can go." I should have left. I had been fired. I had been fired live, on air, in front of 60,000 witnesses, without cause or private warning or basic professional courtesy. And I had no contractual obligation, no ethical obligation, no reason of any kind to stay in that booth, or at that board, or in this converted warehouse studio for 1 more second. I stood up. I set the screwdriver on the stool beside her headphones. I walked out of the booth. I sat down at the mixing board. I put on my headphones. I pulled up the session. I checked her levels. She was watching me through the glass. The thing is, and I will admit this plainly, here, to myself, if to no one else, I could not leave her sounding anything less than exactly what she was. I had spent 3 months learning the specific architecture of her voice, the way her breath moved before a long sentence, The slight lift in her lower frequencies when she was being precise, the almost inaudible dip in the mid-range when she was working through something complicated and her body's attention was somewhere other than her diaphragm. I knew her voice the way you know a landscape you have walked every morning in changing weather. I knew where it was reliable and where it needed support and where it was quietly spectacular when you stopped correcting it and just let it go. She had just fired me on air, and I was sitting at her mixing board, making sure she sounded like a god. She watched me through the glass the entire broadcast, not continuously. She was professional. She did her job. She spoke to 60,000 listeners about film scores and the silence between movements and why certain sounds live in the body instead of the mind, which was her subject and her gift and the reason her audience had been with her for 15 years. But between sentences, between thoughts, at the long deliberate pauses she used to let a point settle, she looked through the glass. At me. I did not look back. I watched the waveforms. Her voice, 2:14 in the morning, on a segment about the specific frequency of grief. There are sounds the body memorizes before the mind does. The mind categorizes, interprets, builds context. But the body simply receives. And once it has received a particular sound, a particular voice, a particular silence, it does not forget. It does not choose to forget. The sound becomes structural, part of the architecture of how you move through a room. I moved the high shelf filter 0.3 of a decibel. Her voice settled into the monitors like a hand pressing flat against glass. I did not think about what she had said. I absolutely did not think about what she had said. The broadcast ended at 2 a.m. exactly. The on-air sign went dark. The studio dropped into that particular species of silence that only exists in soundproofed rooms after midnight. Not empty, but pressurized, the way air inside a sealed container holds itself differently from open air. I pulled off my headphones. I set them on the board in the exact spot where I had left them every night for 3 months. To the right of the master fader, cable-coiled ear cups facing up. Habit, muscle memory. I was already doing the things I did at the end of a shift while being fully aware that this was the end of my last shift. And there was something faintly absurd about that which I chose not to examine too carefully. I started breaking down my kit. The booth door opened. Lyra came out and stood on the other side of the mixing board. She had taken off the headphone rig she used during broadcast, but she was still wearing the silver ear cuff, left ear, exactly where it always was. Her hair was loose over her shoulders, and she kept it back in a clip until airtime, then let it fall for broadcast. It was one of her rituals, the only one that seemed personal rather than technical. She had shed the blazer. She was in the silk blouse alone now, sleeves still buttoned, and she stood very still with both hands resting on the far edge of the mixing board and looked at me. I looked at the cables in my hands. She said very quietly, "Why didn't you leave?" I looked up. She looked. And this surprised me because in 3 months she had not once looked anything other than calibrated. Tired. Not cold. Tired. There was a quality around her eyes that I had not seen before, a kind of weight that had nothing to do with the hour, and her mouth was doing something complicated that I could not quite read from where I was standing. I said, "You were live. Someone had to make sure you sounded good." She did not move. She did not look away. She said, "You just got fired." I said, "I know." The ventilation system was the only thing making sound. A low, constant hum, barely audible, the kind of sound you stop registering after 20 minutes in a room and only notice again in its absence. I had been in this studio enough hours to have stopped registering it weeks ago, and now I was registering it again, which meant something had changed in the composition of the silence. She was looking at me the way she looked at waveforms, like she was trying to isolate a frequency no one else could hear. I finished wrapping the first cable. I set it in the case. I reached for the second one. She came around the board. I did not move. I was sitting in the engineer's chair, swiveled slightly toward the case I was packing, and she came around the end of the board and stopped directly in front of me. Close. Closer than professional distance. I could smell her from here. Something clean, faintly cedar with an undertone I had been trying to name for 3 months without success. Something cool and botanical, like cold air through a window that opened onto trees. I looked up at her. She was looking down at me with that same expression, isolating a frequency. And then she lifted one hand and placed it on the back of my neck. Not pulling, not gripping, just resting there, warm and deliberate. Her palm against the nape of my neck and her fingers reaching up into the short, fine hair at the base of my skull. And I felt every nerve ending in my spine light up in sequence, the way a board goes live. One circuit after another, clean and immediate and utterly without my permission. I did not move. I did not breathe. She said, "I didn't want to fire you." My voice came out steadier than I deserved. I said, "Then why did you?" Her thumb moved. Once. Against the base of my skull, a slow, deliberate pressure that traced a small arc and then stilled again. I felt the movement travel down the back of my neck and continue into my shoulders and keep going, and the part of my brain that was still trying to function in a professional capacity filed this information under. "Do not think about this right now," she said very quietly. "Because I couldn't keep working with you." I said, "That's not an explanation." She said, "No." Her thumb moved again, the same arc, slower this time. And then she said, "It's a confession." Something in her voice caught on the last word. Not much. A barely there roughness at the end of confession that was not fatigue and was not Mike Drymouth and was not anything I had heard in her voice in 3 months of listening to it with more attention than I had ever given to anything in my professional life. It was almost nothing. The kind of thing that would not have registered on any meter. The kind of thing you would miss if you were not specifically listening for it. I had been specifically listening for it for 3 months without knowing that was what I was doing. I said, "A confession." She said, "Yes." I said, "Of what exactly?" She looked at me. The hand at the back of my neck did not move. Her dark eyes were very steady and very direct, and the quality of her stillness had changed. It was not the controlled stillness of broadcast anymore, the trained quietude of someone who had spent 15 years making silence serve her. It was the stillness of effort, of something held. She said, "That I've been making decisions about this studio based on the fact that you're in it, and I don't do that. I've never done that. And I couldn't correct for it, and I couldn't stop doing it, and so I removed the variable." I said, "I'm the variable." She said, "You were, yes." I looked at her. She looked back. I said, "And now?" She said, "Now you're something else." Her thumb stilled at the base of my skull. The cedar and cool air scent of her was in my lungs. The studio was completely silent except for the ventilation hum, and even that seemed to have retreated, as if the room was making space for whatever was about to happen in it. I thought, I have been fired. I should be angry. I am distantly still angry. I am also sitting in an engineer's chair at 2 a.m, with the hand of the most controlled person I have ever met, resting on the back of my neck and warmth traveling down my spine in long, careful waves. And I am making a choice right now about whether to stand up and leave or stay exactly where I am. And the choice I am making is transparent to both of us. I stayed exactly where I was. The cable I had been wrapping was still in my left hand, half coiled, forgotten. She said more quietly, "I owe you an apology." I said, "Yes." She said, "On air that was not how I intended." She stopped. Started again. I made a decision and I executed it, and I did not account for another stop. Longer. This was remarkable. I want to be precise about this. In 3 months of working within 15 feet of Lyra Ashford, I had never heard her not finish a sentence. I had heard her construct sentences of considerable complexity under pressure, mid-broadcast while reading breaking information off a monitor, and the sentences were always complete, always exactly as long as they needed to be. She edited in real time with the precision of someone who had built a career on the understanding that what you say and how you say it are not separate things. She had now failed to finish 2 sentences in a row. I said carefully, "You didn't account for what?" She looked at me. The hand at my neck was absolutely still, and she said, "The fact that you would stay." I held this. It had a specific weight. I turned it over. I said, "You fired me because working with me had become..." What? Distracting? The word landed wrong. I could see it. Something shifted in the set of her jaw. She said, "That's not..." I said, "Then tell me what it is." Long silence. The ventilation hum. Her thumb against the base of my skull, motionless, but still there. She had not removed her hand, and I had not asked her to, and we were both entirely aware of this. She said, "It's the opposite of distracting." I said, "What does that mean?" She said, "It means I am more precise when you're in the room, more exact. I hear things I don't hear when you're not there. A beat." That was the problem. I thought about this, about what it meant, about the frequency of grief she had spoken about at 2:14 in the morning, about sounds the body memorizes before the mind does. I said, that sounds like a reason to keep me, not fire me. She said, it would be, if that were all it was. The silence after this was a different species from the silence before it. It had edges, shape, the quality of something that has been in a sealed container and is now exposed to open air and beginning, slowly, to change. I said, Lyra. She said, don't. I said, I haven't said anything yet. She said, I know what you're going to say. I said, then you're a step ahead of me, because I have no idea what I'm going to say. Something almost moved in her expression. Not quite a smile. The ghost of the possibility of one, if smiling were something she allowed herself in rooms like this, she said, you're going to ask me to explain myself. I said, I wasn't actually. I was going to say your name and then not know what to say after it. The ghost of the smile again, closer this time, she said, that's unlike you. I said, you've known me for 3 months. She said, I've been watching you for 3 months, that's different. I did not know what to do with this. My body did, apparently, because I felt heat move up the side of my neck, the specific side where her hand was not, which was a distinction my nervous system had apparently decided was important enough to track. The cable was still in my left hand. I set it down carefully on the edge of the board, as if setting it down quietly would draw less attention to the fact that I had forgotten I was holding it. She noticed. Of course she noticed, she said. You stayed through the entire broadcast? I said, someone had to. She said, you were the only one here. I said, the other engineers cleared out when you made the announcement. She said, and you didn't. I said, I did my job. She said, yes? A pause. You did. Her thumb moved again at the base of my skull, that same slow arc, warmer than before, and I felt the warmth travel in both directions, up through my scalp and down into the back of my shoulders. And I thought, with the portion of my brain that was still reliably engaged in rational thought, this is information. This is just information. You can file this and return to it later when you're not in a soundproof studio at 2 in the morning, with her hand on your neck and the cedar and cool air scent of her in your lungs. I did not file it. There was nowhere to put it. She said, I need you to know that the decision I made tonight was... She paused. Not an accurate reflection of how I assess your work. I said, you fired me live on air, in front of 60,000 listeners, without cause or warning. She said, yes. I said, that is going to require a substantially more specific apology than not an accurate reflection. Something shifted in her expression, real this time. The controlled surface of it cracked along one precise line, and what came through was, not quite amusement, but adjacent. An acknowledgement. The look of someone encountering a specific quality in another person that they did not expect and cannot immediately categorize. She said, you're right. I said, I know. She looked at me. And then she said, poet, my name in her voice. She had used it before, twice in 3 months, once when she had a technical question that required my specific expertise, and once when I had made a call during broadcast that had been unusual, and she needed to understand why I had made it. Both times precise, professional, bracketed neatly by context. This time it had no bracket. It was just my name in her voice in a quiet room, and the way it landed in my chest was entirely different from both previous times and from anything I had been prepared for. I said, yes. She said, I am sorry for how I did it. The medium was wrong. I said, the medium was 60,000 people. She said, yes. I said, Lyra, what were you actually trying to do? Long pause, her hand at the back of my neck, the ventilation hum, the city through the warehouse windows, cold and completely uninvested in this conversation. She said, I was trying to create distance. I said, did it work? She looked at me. Her hand was still on my neck. We were close enough that I could see the specific quality of her stillness. Not absence of movement, but the discipline of it. The visible effort of someone holding a very precise amount of pressure against a very precise resistance. She said, no. The hand at the back of my neck shifted slightly. Not away, just redistributed. Her fingers curved fractionally more into the base of my skull, the heel of her palm settling against the side of my neck. And the warmth that had been traveling in waves now settled into something more constant, more even, like a frequency that had found its correct pitch and stopped searching. I thought, I am going to remember exactly how this feels for a very long time. I thought, that is a problem I will deal with later. Her hand was still on my neck. The question it was asking, if it was asking one which I was not certain of because I was not certain of anything at 2 a.m. in a soundproofed room, was the question I had been not quite asking for 3 months at a mixing board, and neither of us was moving toward an answer, and neither of us was moving away from one, and the silence between us had the specific quality of a recording that has not yet started, full of potential, holding everything it was about to become. I said, "What happens now?" She said, "I don't know." I said, "You always know." She said, "Not right now." And something about the plainness of that, the absence of the usual precision, the sentence left raw at the edges without any of her characteristic architecture holding it in shape, landed in the center of my chest and stayed there. Her hand was still on my neck. I was still sitting exactly where I had been when she came around the board. My case was half packed beside me. The cable I had been coiling was on the board edge. The headphones I set down every night in exactly the same spot were in exactly the same spot. Everything was where it always was, except for the hand on my neck and the fact that I had been fired 4 hours ago and was still in this room. She was still watching me. The quality of her attention at this proximity was different from how it had felt through the glass. Not mediated now, not filtered through a sheet of studio spec laminate. Direct. The dark eyes with the depth in them that I had categorized as professional focus for 3 months and was having increasing difficulty continuing to categorize that way. I said, "You could sit down." She said, "I'm fine." I said, "You've been standing since before broadcast." She said, "I'm aware." I said, "There's a chair." She said, "Poet." I said, "Yes." She said, "Stop being practical at me." I said, "It's the only setting I have at 2 a.m. Her expression did something I had not seen it do in 3 months. It softened. Not fully, not the kind of softening that dismantles, but at the edges, just at the outer edges, the careful control of it easing by a degree that was small but unmistakable, the way a very precise frequency shift is small and unmistakable. She said very quietly, "I know," and then she sat, not in the chair, on the edge of the board beside me, angled toward me, close enough that her knee was almost touching mine, and she kept her hand on the back of my neck and I let her, and neither of us said anything for a moment that was long enough to have a shape. The ventilation hum continued its single, unvarying note. Outside, through the warehouse windows, the city was beginning its first imperceptible shift from deep night toward early morning. Not lighter yet, not even close, but the specific quality of the dark had changed in the way it does in the last hour before 4 a.m., like something adjusting its weight in sleep. She said, "Tell me something." I said, "What?" She said, "Anything. Something I don't know. I thought about this." I said, "The frequency response of the Neumann shifts when you turn your head left. I've been correcting for it from the board for 6 weeks." She was quiet for a moment. Then, "I know." I said, "You knew?" She said, "I heard you compensating. 3rd night of the 2nd month." I didn't say anything because... She stopped. I said, "Because why?" She said, "Because if I mentioned it, I would have had to explain how I knew. And explaining how I knew would have required admitting that I had been listening to what you were doing at the board with more attention than I was giving my own broadcast." I held this. I said, "That must have been inconvenient." She said, "Extraordinarily." I said, "Is that when you started trying to create distance?" She said, "That's when I started noticing that I couldn't." Her thumb moved again, the arc at the base of my skull, slow and deliberate, and this time I felt it differently. Not as something arriving, but as something I had been waiting for, which was a distinction with significant implications that I chose, for the moment, not to examine. The warmth of her palm against the back of my neck had become a fixed point. The studio organized itself around it the way a room organizes around a single light source. Everything else relative to this. She said, "Your voice." I said, "What?" She said, "You don't use it in the studio. You use signals, board talk. When you need to tell me something during broadcast, you use the talkback system and you keep it technical. You never..." She paused. I've never heard you just talk in this room without a reason. I said. I didn't think you wanted that. She said. No. I waited. She said. That's not why I noticed it. I said. Then why? She was quiet for a moment. Outside the windows, a car passed on the street 3 floors below, headlights sweeping briefly across the ceiling and gone. She said, because the one time I did hear it, you thought I was still in the booth. You were talking to yourself, apparently, about the session, going over the lineup, and your voice is... She stopped again, started differently. The microphone I use, the reason it works is not frequency response. Frequency response is technical. What makes a voice work is what it carries, what it contains, even when it's saying nothing important. You were listing track times, and I stood on the other side of that door for 4 minutes because I could not make myself open it. The silence after this had the quality of something that had been inside a pressurized space for a very long time and had just been released. I said, 4 minutes, she said. Approximately, I said, and then you opened the door. She said, and then I opened the door. I said, and went directly to your notes. She said, yes, I said, and said nothing. She said, I said, we're going long on the Goretzky segment, pull 90 seconds from the 3rd block. I said, I remember, she said. I imagine so. It was approximately 8 words after 4 minutes of... She did not finish. I said, 4 minutes of what? She looked at me. The dark eyes, the particular depth of them, and the quality of her attention at this distance was a physical event in the center of my chest. Specific, warm, not at all like the professional focus I had been cataloging it as. She said, standing in a hallway being grateful that you couldn't see me. I sat with this, the hand at the back of my neck, the cedar scent, the city through the glass, doing its early morning recalibration in the dark. I said, Lyra, she said. Yes, I said. I've been compensating for your frequency response at the board for 6 weeks. She looked at me. Something shifted in her expression. Something that was, again, almost a smile. Closer this time, close enough to be legible, to have the specific quality of warmth that I had been cataloging for 3 months under the heading Professional Acknowledgement and was now revising. She said, I know, I said. That was my version of standing in a hallway. Her thumb stilled against the base of my skull. The warmth of her palm was constant. The frequency of it, if frequency were the right word, which it was not, but the frequency of it had been consistent long enough now that my nervous system had stopped registering it as new information and started registering it as ground, as the baseline from which everything else was measured. She said, was it? It was not quite a question. The inflection of it landed somewhere between question and recognition. I said, yes. She looked at me for a long moment. Whatever she was calculating behind those dark eyes, the calculation was not visible, but the fact of it was. The slight focusing quality, the stillness that was effort, the breath she was taking carefully and releasing carefully. And then she said, very quietly, I didn't want to fire you. I said, you said that. She said, I mean, She paused, started again. The night I made the decision, I sat in my car outside this building for 45 minutes. I said, that's a long time to sit in a car. She said, I was trying to find another way. I said, did you? She said, no. I said, there wasn't one? She said, there were many. None of them. She stopped. I said, none of them what? She said, none of them were things I could actually do. I held this, the hand at the back of my neck, the ventilation hum, constant as a held note, the orange-amber glow of the board and standby, the only warm light left in the studio now that the on-air sign was dark, the rest of the space in its usual blue-gray after-midnight shadow. I said, what are the things you can actually do? She looked at me. The question sat between us with its full weight. I had not meant it to be as direct as it was. Or perhaps I was, as she had observed, not using my voice in this room very often, and when I did it tended toward the practical, and this was, in its way, a practical question. What are the available options? What does the board show? What can be worked with? She said, this. She leaned forward and kissed me. Her mouth on mine was nothing like I had imagined it. Not that I had imagined it, except in the specific way that you do not imagine things that you refuse to let yourself imagine, where the refusal is so careful and continuous that the shape of the thing you're refusing becomes visible in the effort of the refusal. Her mouth was warmer than expected. The kiss was not tentative. It was precise. The same quality of precision I had been watching her apply to everything for 3 months. And her hand at the back of my neck tightened slightly, not pulling, just present, and I felt it through my entire spine in one clean line from the base of my skull to somewhere in my lower back. I kissed her back. My hands found the edge of the board. The mixing board I had spent 3 months learning by texture and position in the dark, and I gripped it and kissed her back and tasted black coffee, and something else, something faintly sweet that I could not place, something that was hers, specific to her, that I had not been close enough before to encounter. She pulled back. 1 inch. Her hand was still on my neck. Her breathing was, not uneven, not quite, but present in a way it had not been before, audible in the silence. She was looking at my mouth, then at my eyes. She said, "I've been thinking about doing that for 3 weeks." I said, "Only 3 weeks?" Something in her expression shifted, darker. Something that was not composure and was not its absence, but was a third thing. A thing that existed in the space between the version of her that controlled every audible second and the version I was beginning to understand had been sitting in her car for 45 minutes looking at the door to a building. She said, "Closer to 12. I said, 12 weeks. She said, "Almost since," I said, "since the first night," she said, "since the first calibration check." I thought about the first calibration check. The night I had arrived for my first nocturne shift, 3 months ago, 11:50 p.m., shown to the board by the outgoing engineer who had approximately 11 minutes to spare and used them to convey the most essential information in the fastest possible register. The Neumann is her instrument. Do not adjust without telling her. She will know if you do. She can hear the difference between 47.3 and 47.7 on the parametric. Do not think she cannot. She had walked into the booth at 11:58 p.m. She had not acknowledged me. She had stood in front of the mic, closed her eyes for 10 seconds, and then said through the talkback, "Flat the 4K shelf by 1.2 and give me back 2 on the 80. I had done it. She had said, "Better." She had never looked at me. I had looked at her through the glass for approximately 6 uninterrupted hours and attributed it entirely to the professional fact of monitoring. 12 weeks, I said. You didn't show it. She said, "I'm aware." I said, "At all. Not once." She said, "That was deliberate." I said, "And then you fired me live on the air." She said, "That was also deliberate." I said, "That is a very aggressive way to not show something." Her expression did the thing again, the edge softening, the almost. And then she kissed me again. Slower this time. Her free hand came up and her fingers touched my jaw. Not holding, just present, at the hinge of my jaw on the right side. Thumb resting against my cheekbone. And the quality of the contact was so specific, so exact, that I registered it with complete anatomical precision. The temperature of her fingers slightly cooler than expected at first contact and then warming. The light pressure, the exact location. She pulled back. She pulled. Her hands were still on me, one at the back of my neck, one at my jaw, and she was looking at me with both of them, and her breathing was something that required attention now, not uneven, but no longer the controlled inhalation of broadcast. She said, I said, "If you say I should let you go, I'm going to be genuinely irritated." She said, "I was going to say I should have done this differently." I said, "Oh," she said. "The broadcasting it was not." She stopped. "I was trying to make it definitive, to make it something I couldn't undo." I said, "The 60,000 witnesses." She said, "Yes," I said. "As a failsafe." She said, "Yes," I said. "Against yourself." She said, "Yes." I looked at her, the hands on my neck and jaw, the cedar scent closer now than it had ever been. The quality of the dark in the room, the orange warmth of the board, the faint hum of the ventilation system doing its single-note work in the background. I said, "It didn't work." She said, "No." I said, "Because I stayed." She said, "Because you stayed." Her thumb moved against the base of my skull. The same arc. I had felt it 4 times now, and each time it was slightly different from the time before. Not the movement itself, which was precise and consistent, but the weight it carried, which accumulated. First time, incidental warmth. Second time, warmth with attention in it. Third time, warmth with intention, which was different. Fourth time, something that I was going to have to name eventually, not right now, but eventually. She said, "I owe you more than an apology." I said, "Probably," she said. "I'll figure out the specifics." I said, "Take your time. I have nowhere to be. I've been fired." The edge softening, the almost smile, sustained this time long enough to qualify as an actual thing that was happening in her face. She said, "Poet?" I said, "Yes." She said, "I'm going to need you to be in this studio." I said, "I've noticed." She said, "That's not—" She paused. "I mean," I said, "I know what you mean." She said, "Do you?" I said, "You mean you're going to need me to be in the studio, and you're also going to need me to be in the studio? And you'd prefer to handle those as 2 separate matters, but they appear to have become the same matter, and you don't know what to do about that." She looked at me. Something moved through her expression that was not quite any one thing. Not surprise exactly, but the adjacent quality, the recognition of being seen with more precision than expected. She said, "Yes." I said, "Neither do I." She said, "That's almost reassuring." I said, "Almost?" She said, "Almost." Her hand at the back of my neck shifted. Not away, the opposite. She drew me slightly forward, just slightly, and kissed me again. And this time it was different from the first and different from the second. There was something in it that had not been in the previous 2, a quality of the restraint releasing in small, careful increments. The way a frequency builds not by sudden jump, but by a slow and certain increase that you only recognize as having grown substantial when you measure it against where it began. When she pulled back, her breathing was audible. Mine was not much better. She said quietly, "I've been managing this for 3 months." I said, "I know." She said, "How did you know?" I said, "Because I've been managing it for 3 months." The studio, for a moment, had a quality that I can only describe as held. As if everything in it, the board, the glass wall of the booth, the Neumann on its mount in the dark, the French press on the corner table with the last inch of coffee in it that we had both been drinking from all night without either of us acknowledging that we were doing this. As if everything in it had been arranged by someone who understood the specific geometry of 2 people at the moment, just before something irreversible, and had set the room accordingly. Her hand was at the back of my neck. My hand, I realized, had moved from the edge of the board at some point during that 3rd kiss and was now resting against the silk of her blouse at her ribs. Not gripping, just present. My fingers aware of the warmth of her through the fabric and the shift of her breath under my palm. She looked down at my hand, then back at me. She said, "Poet." I said, "Yes." She said, "I'm going to—" She paused. Her jaw set fractionally, a quality of decision. "I would like to—" I said, "Yes." She said, "I haven't finished." I said, "Yes." She looked at me. Something in her expression did the thing it had been doing in small increments for the past 40 minutes, but more completely now. The controlled surface not breaking, but choosing, deliberately and visibly, to release. A decision made with full knowledge of what it was and what it meant. She said very quietly, "You can go whenever you want." I said, "I know." She said, "I need you to know that." I said, "I do." She said, "Good." And then she pressed me against the mixing board. One hand flat on the surface beside my ribs. The board I had learned by texture and position. The board that was my entire professional world in this room. And the other at my hip, warm and certain, and her mouth found the side of my throat just below my ear. The warmth of her breath against that specific location did something to my nervous system that had no clinical name, and that I had clearly been avoiding thinking about for a very long time. Because the moment it happened, I recognized it as something I had been not thinking about for 3 months. Her lips against my throat, not quite a kiss, more precise than a kiss, a deliberate placement of warmth in a specific location, held there, and then breath. A single controlled breath directed against my skin. My knees forgot their structural purpose. I grabbed the edge of the board with both hands. Her mouth moved lower to the curve where my throat met my shoulder, and her hand at my hip slid around to the small of my back, and she pulled me forward into her with a deliberateness that had the same quality as everything else she did. Not a sweep, not a loss of control, but a choice, executed precisely. Against my skin, she said, "I've been thinking about firing you for 3 weeks." My hands on the edge of the board, the orange warmth of the standby lights, cedar and something botanical, and the specific warmth of her body against mine. 3 months of waveforms and frequency corrections and standing in separate rooms and not looking through glass and looking through glass and filing things under headings that were not the correct headings. I said nothing. I had lost access to language entirely. And then her mouth moved lower and her hand slid from the small of my back, and I stopped tracking the room by any coordinate I had previously known, and something in the architecture of the preceding 3 months, the careful distance, and the corrected frequencies, and the 45 minutes in a car, and the 4 minutes in a hallway, and the 6 weeks of compensation at the board. All of it arrived at once, at the specific location her mouth had just reached, and my hands tightened on the edge of the board, and I stopped breathing. And outside the warehouse windows, the city continued its cold, indifferent recalibration, and the ventilation system held its single note. And the Neumann stood on its mount, in the dark booth, and the on-air signs stayed off. And none of this was audible to 60,000 listeners, and I was acutely, entirely aware of all of it, and aware of none of it, because her mouth was on my throat, and her hand was at the small of my back, and the frequency she was working at had found its pitch and stopped searching. I said, "Lyra?" She said against my skin. "Yes," I said. "Don't stop." She didn't. Her hands were at my waist. She walked me backward slowly, deliberate, unhurried, the way she moved through every space she occupied, until the glass wall of the booth was at my back, cold and solid, and she was at my front, warm and solid. And I was between 2 surfaces, and the specific geometry of this had a charge to it that my body registered at every point of contact and several points of almost contact. Her mouth found my jaw, my cheekbone, the corner of my eye, barely, a breath more than a kiss. She moved with the patience of someone who has thought about this carefully and has decided that there is no rush, that the time is theirs, that the room belongs to them and has always belonged to them and will continue to belong to them, and the only question was what to do with that knowledge. She pulled back far enough to look at me. 1 inch, 2. The dark eyes and the depth in them and the particular quality of her attention that I had spent 3 months cataloging under wrong headings. She said, "You're still here." I said, "Yes." She said, "You could." I said, "I know." She said, "Poet." I said, "Lyra, I've been compensating for your frequency response for 6 weeks and staying through a live on-air firing, and I am currently pressed against the wall of your booth at 2:30 in the morning. I think we can proceed on the assumption that I'm here." Her expression, the full version of what I had been watching in fragments for 3 months. The edge softening at its full extent, which was not soft, not precisely, but warm, real. The absence of the careful architecture of control, not because it had collapsed, but because she had chosen to put it down. "Here, in this room, for this," she said. "Yes." She kissed me again. Her hands slid under the hem of my cream cable-knit sweater, warm palms flat against my ribs, skin against skin, and the contrast between the cold glass at my back and the warmth of her hands against my sides made me audibly inhale. She felt it. The quality of her attention shifted, more concentrated, more specific, like a frequency adjustment, isolating exactly the signal she was looking for. She said into my neck, "Take this off." I pulled the sweater over my head. The studio air was cool against my skin. I was wearing a thin white camisole underneath, and she looked at me, set my chest, the outline of me visible through the fabric, my breathing fast and shallow and utterly unmanaged. And something in her expression did what it had been doing in degrees all night, but now completely. Darker. The controlled restraint fully at rest, fully replaced by something that had been waiting behind it with considerable patience. She said, "Turn around." I turned around, my palms flat against the glass of the booth wall. The studio in front of me, dark, empty, silent, all its equipment standing at attention in the blue-gray shadow, the board with its standby amber, the Neumann in the booth behind the glass I was pressing my hands against. She pressed against me from behind, her body against mine, the entire length, the warmth of her, and the cedar scent now fully surrounding. And her arms came around me and her hands found my waist first, and then moved, slow and deliberate. And I felt my breathing change to something involuntary and shallow and uncontrolled. Her mouth was at my neck again, at the specific place just below my ear where she had placed her breath before, and the accumulated weight of every time she had been close enough for me to register her proximity. Every broadcast, every board session, every moment through the glass arrived at that location simultaneously, and I felt it in every nerve ending along my spine. She said against my ear, her voice low and exactly as controlled as it always was, which was somehow worse than if it had not been. "I'm going to make you come. Right here. Do you understand?" I nodded. I had entirely lost access to speech. Outside, the city, the ventilation hum. The amber of the mixing board, the dark Neumann on its mount. Her hands moved. I felt slickness between my thighs, certain and undeniable, and the part of my brain that was still in any way connected to professional function or rational categorization went quietly offline. And I stopped trying to name any of this under any heading at all, and simply was here, in this room, against this glass, with her hands and her mouth and the accumulated weight of 12 weeks of managed distance arriving all at once. She turned me around, kissed me once, hard and certain. Her eyes met mine, asking, and I held her gaze and nodded, yes. And she kissed me once more, and then she dropped to her knees in front of me. I stared down at her. Lyra Ashford, 15 years, 3 awards, editorial veto over every audible second of every broadcast Nocturne had produced in the past decade. The most controlled presence I had ever occupied a room with. On her knees on the studio floor, looking up at me with those dark eyes and the specific quality of her expression at this angle. Open, intent, something in it that I had not seen in 3 months or 12 weeks or any of the accumulated hours of glass-separated proximity, was its own species of devastating. She reached for the waist of my jeans. Her fingers were precise and unhurried. She looked up at me once more, and this was the moment. Not the touch, not what came after, but this, the specific quality of her looking up at me, the asking without diminishment, the full weight of everything she was choosing to do and was choosing it freely and without any loss of what she was. She said, "Yes?" I said, "Yes." She pulled down my jeans, my underwear, put her mouth on me. The sensation arrived without preamble or gradient, immediate, obliterating. The warm certainty of her tongue and the quality of her attention applied here as it was applied to everything, with complete precision, with the specific expertise of someone who has learned a thing the way you learn a landscape by walking it in every kind of weather. I grabbed her hair with both hands, that long, straight black hair I had been watching fall over her shoulders for 12 weeks, and she made a sound against me that vibrated through my entire lower body, low and pleased and utterly uncontrolled. That sound. In 15 years of broadcast, in 3 awards, in editorial control of every audible second, that sound had not been public. That sound had not been for 60,000 listeners, or for the ventilation system, or for the city through the windows. That sound was here, in this room, at this frequency, directed entirely at the specific location of me, and it was the first completely unmanaged thing I had ever heard from her, and it broke through my chest in a way that was not only physiological. I said her name, once, sharp and involuntary. "Lyra." She looked up at me, her mouth still on me, her dark eyes finding mine in the amber light. And that was it. That was the moment, her composure. Not broken, but released, fully and visibly released. Her eyes wet at the edges in a way that was not performance and not management and not anything she had intended to show. Her face open at every place it was usually closed, and she moaned against me. Into me, raw and unguarded, the sound of someone who has stopped deciding what they will and will not allow themselves. I came. Her name in my mouth and my hands in her hair and the sensation moving through me in waves I could neither stop nor direct. My knees giving entirely, and she caught me, both hands at my hips, holding me up, steady and certain, and kept her mouth on me until the waves stopped and I was breathing in long, ragged increments against the glass. When I could hold my own weight again, she stood. She put both hands on either side of my face, the heel of her palms warm against my cheeks, her fingers in my hair. And she looked at me, openly, without architecture, without the careful management, and kissed me once, slow and deep and thorough. And I tasted myself on her mouth and felt the last of the 3 months dissolve completely into the amber and the dark and the cedar and the single-note hum of the ventilation system. I don't know how we got to the floor. I know that we were on it, eventually, my back against the base of the mixing board, her body half over mine, both of us still breathing unevenly into the quiet room. The French press was on the corner table. The Neumann stood in the dark booth behind its glass. My headphones were in their spot on the board above us, cable-coiled, ear cups facing up. Everything was where it always was. Nothing was what it had been. She had one hand at the back of my neck, not the questioning version, not the tentative first placement from 40 minutes earlier that had lit up my entire spine. The version with everything in it, possessive, certain, unhurried. The version that had arrived at the far end of 12 weeks of managed distance and decided at last where it was going to rest. I said, "You can't fire me and then do that," she said. "I just did." I said, "Lyra." She kissed my temple, her mouth warm and deliberate against my hairline. She said very quietly, "I'll hire you back. Tomorrow. Different title, same work. I needed one night where you weren't my employee." I looked at her. The dark eyes, close now, at a distance I had not had access to for 3 months and that the preceding hour had given me entirely. She looked back. No distance, no deflection, no careful architecture, just the look of someone who has stopped managing the variable and is now in the room with it. I said, "One night?" She said nothing for a moment. Her thumb moved against the base of my skull, the same arc, the same deliberate pressure, and this time it had the weight of everything. 12 weeks of glass-separated calibration, the 45 minutes in a car, the 4 minutes in a hallway, the 6 weeks of frequency compensation, the live on-air firing as a failsafe against herself. All of it returned now in this single small movement. Its meaning changed utterly from what it had been in its first incidental appearance. She said, "We'll see." I said nothing. I looked at the ceiling, the warehouse rafters in the dark above us, the cold city light through the high windows, the room that had been my professional world for 3 months and was now something else entirely. The ventilation hum, constant, indifferent, her hand at the back of my neck. I thought about saying, "You're going to have to be more specific than that." I thought about saying, "I need to know what you're actually offering." I thought about the practical question, the title, the contract, the 60,000 witnesses who had heard her fire me and would hear whatever she said tomorrow. And then I stopped thinking about all of them because her thumb moved again. That slow arc at the base of my skull and the practical questions receded to the exact distance they deserved at 2:30 in the morning on the floor of a soundproof studio. I said, "What time tomorrow?" She said, "Noon." I said, "My rate goes up." She said, "I know." I said, "Significantly." She said, "I expected nothing less." I looked at her. She was almost smiling. The full version of it now, not the ghost of the possibility, but the thing itself, contained and warm, and specifically for me, the first time it had existed at full extent in a room I was in. I thought, I am going to say yes. I already know I am going to say yes. The question it is not exactly whether I say yes, but when, and I am choosing not to make it easy, and she knows this, and we are both fine with it. Her hand was at the back of my neck, the warmth of it constant, the frequency of it settled, the room dark and amber and quiet around us, the city doing its earliest morning work through the high windows, and the Neumann standing in the dark booth behind its glass, and the on-air sign, dark. The silver ear cuff caught a slant of light from somewhere. I did not say yes or no. I let her hand rest at the back of my neck, and I breathed in cedar and the specific cool botanical thing I had never quite named, and I looked at the ceiling of the studio that had been mine for 3 months and was something else now, something without a clean professional category, something I was going to need a different kind of attention to describe. The question remained open, something unresolved in the architecture of the room and of the two of us in it. She did not push for an answer. She understood, I thought, that the waiting was its own kind of answer, that the fact that I was still here, on the floor, in the amber, her hand at the back of my neck, my voice at rest in the room that had kept it for 12 weeks in the space between frequencies, was a thing she had already been told. She kissed my temple once more. said nothing. I thought, I have been managing this for 3 months, and then I stopped. The ventilation hum held its note. Outside, the dark was just barely beginning to consider the possibility of not being dark. Her hand, my neck, the room,